It's so nice that I'm able to make one of these videos and not have to convince everybody that the character I'm talking about is good. I might have to cut out the background audio because that crane is making a lot of noise. Hello, and welcome to the Ineffa 101. I'm actually really surprised that I'm doing this early, because as I have not stopped talking about, Emily is conceptually a very similarly designed unit and has a lot of the same flexibility and intriguing use cases that Ineffa does. But since she wasn't that numerically strong compared to the newer units coming out, she kind of got pushed to the wayside when it came to meta talks. But Ineffa has had a very different story. As soon as Nodcry fully came out, she shot to the top of the meta, and she has been defending her place there ever since. It's reached the point where I think I could make a decent argument for Ineffa being the best unit in the game. Now, I'm not going to do that because at the end of the day, the best unit in the game is incredibly subjective. It depends on what you specifically want out of the game, but for me specifically, that's Ineffa. Ineffa is not only extremely numerically powerful, but she's incredibly versatile, and she uses her numbers to prop up other characters in interesting ways. Now, I can kind of feel that this is going to be a pretty long video. Not only do I have to go over Ineffa's kit, but I have to talk about lunar-charged and how that affects other units. I, of course, am going to have to talk about flins, because I imagine that's what a lot of people are going to come to this video for. And while she's not even out yet, I am definitely going to need to talk about Columbina. Not only is she getting a banner at the same time as Ineffa's rerun, but to be a particularly strong unit, Columbina needs another Nodcry 5-stars in her team to buff, and in a lot of teams, that Nodcry 5-star is Ineffa. I'm going to talk about this more later, but right now, a lot of Columbina's strength is tied up in Ineffa. There are so many topics I have to get to, and before any of that, I also have to talk about our sponsor. Yeah, thanks LD Shop for making this video even longer than it already was gonna be. But actually, thank you. Sponsorships like these allow me to focus on making higher quality videos that I really want to make. And also LD Shop is like actually a good website. LD Shop is a top-up website that uses differences in regional pricing to effectively get you discounts on your Genesis crystals. It's the same crystals you are already buying, but for less money. LD Shop doesn't require any sort of sensitive account information from you, only asking for the server you play on and your UID. I've been using LD Shop myself even before they came to me, and the only downside compared to topping up through the regular Hoyo top-up services is that it takes my Genesis crystals a little bit longer to actually get on my account. How much longer? Like 2 minutes, maybe. Using my link in the description and the pinned comment, you can get up to 15% off your Genesis packs. But aside from that, LD Shop is doing a sale for 6.3 and the release of Columbina, discounting Genesis packs by up to 34%. LD Shop, of course, isn't just Genshin, providing these services to a wide variety of games, and you probably play one of these. I mean, you probably play Genshin if you're watching this channel, but if you play anything else, you can also use LD Shop for that. Thank you so much to LD Shop for sponsoring this video and maybe getting some Ineffas because of this video. Let's talk about Ineffa. Now, Ineffa's kit is a little bit strange, as the active talents, the ones that you can level, don't really have that much value. Rather, her active talents are used to gain access to her passive talents, which is where her real value lies. Which I guess we'll start off with the most basic of her passive talents, the lunar-charged conversion. When a party member triggers an electro-charged reaction, it will be converted into a lunar-charged reaction, and then it gets a base damage increase up to 14%, scaling with Ineffa's attack. That buff maxes out at 2,000 attack, and while you probably should try to get that buff maxed out for a few reasons, Ineffa has a lot of other reasons that you would want to build a lot of attack on her, and most of her builds achieve 2,000 attack pretty handily. So what does lunar-charged actually do? How is it different from electro-charged? Well, for the most part, it isn't. There are a lot of changes to the damage formula that makes it look like it would act significantly different to electro-charged, but for most teams, lunar-charged reaction damage isn't going to have any significant utility, and it's going to be doing about the same damage that electro-charged would. So what are those differences? First off, lunar-charged lets you crit. Let's get Kooky on like a 50% crit rate build here, with just Kooky triggering some electro-charges. You can see, we're getting the same lunar charge procs, but some of them are dealing 6,000 damage with a larger number to indicate they critted, while the ones that don't crit are doing 3,000. So that's number one difference. It doesn't just factor in your character's level and elemental mastery for its damage, it also factors their crit stats. The second difference is that multiple units can contribute to lunar-charged damage, which Tulpa makes this particularly easy to show off, and that's why I'm here. With just Kuki, we saw our procs do around 6,000 on crit, but if we introduce Barbara, when we start doing normal attacks on Barbara, we can see our non-crit has gone up to 5,000, and our crit has gone up to 10,000. Even though Barbara is doing hydro damage, and Tulpa is immune to hydro damage, she still counts as having applied hydro, so she gets to contribute to Lunar Charge's damage. So if Lunar Charge damage can crit, and multiple units can contribute to its damage, why is it dealing the same amount of damage as Electrocharged? Well, the answer there is simple. It's that Lunar Charged has a much lower base number. Even though there are more things that you can do to modify its damage and increase its damage, it starts at a much lower base. So even though you're buffing it in more ways than you can buff Electrocharge damage, they do about the same. There's also another mechanic that limits how many units can contribute to your Lunar Charge damage. Or really, it limits how effective multiple units contributing to your Lunar Charge damage is. Essentially, how Lunar Charge damage works, this cloud appears above enemies, and as long as you have both Hydro and Electro on your opponents, every 2 seconds that cloud strikes an opponent, although that's really just a visual effect. They'll take damage automatically every 2 seconds no matter what. But basically what happens is between each of those 2-second procs, the game tracks every unit that has applied either Hydro or Electro to the enemy. Then when it tries to deal damage again, I'm gonna get out of here so I have to stop dodging Tulpa. Before it deals damage again, it takes the stats of all those characters that applied those 2 elements. It checks their level, it checks their EM, it checks their crit stats, and it gives them different weights based on which units are contributing the most damage. The unit with the highest contribution, which is usually going to be a level 90 unit, have a little bit of EM going on, and have some good crit stats going, that unit gets their full damage added on to the Lunar Charge proc. The unit with the second largest contribution gets half of their damage added onto the Lunar Charge proc, which is significantly less, but it's still a meaningful amount of damage, while the third and fourth units only get a 12th of their damage added onto the Lunar Charge proc, which is a negligible amount. Because there's such a harsh fall off in how much the third and fourth units contribute to Lunar Charge damage, you're generally only ever going to have 2 units that get serious contribution to Lunar Charge damage. And because EM is a stat with actual diminishing returns, it does give you less stats the more you stack it. Your Lunar Charge ownership is generally just going to go to the 2 units in the team that have the best crit stats, and for most of you, I'm assuming that means Ineffa and Flins. I'm gonna go a little bit more into the nuances about Lunar Charged and a little bit of goofy stuff that you can do with it when I talk about Flins. But for right now, I think that's most of what you need to know to get the overview of her kit. Lunar Charged is significantly different to Electrocharged, and there are nuances in its mechanics and its damage formula. But for the most part, for most teams, you generally don't really have to worry about it. It's just a nice, consistent damaging reaction that gets you a little bit of extra DPS. So let's get into her active talents. We don't really have to worry that much about her normal attacks now. I'll come back to them later. Primarily, she is an off-field unit. That is what she was designed to be, but she can also set herself up to be a surprisingly effective on-fielder. And for that playstyle, you are gonna wanna level her normal attacks. I'll talk about that in teams later, but for now, let's just look at her skill. Very simple. You press her skill, she makes a shield, and she summons the star of the show, Birgitta! Hello, Birgitta. Birgitta is a fun little robot that floats around, and despite looking like a turret that stays in one place, Birgitta attacks by teleporting underneath opponents and unleashing an electric discharge. Now, that 172% multiplier doesn't look very impressive, and it's not. Going back in game on my decently strong Ineffa build, I'm only hitting for 4,000 damage. While this attack doesn't do a lot of damage on its own, it does attack every other second. It applies Electro on every hit. It hits in a pretty decent AoE, and she has a 66% chance of generating an Electro particle. Now, Ineffa is a primarily damage-dealing character, and right now, she's kinda getting unbelievably mogged by Fischl. They both get their damage from their skills, and Ineffa's only has a 172% multiplier when crowned, attacking once every other second, while Fischl, comparing to a level 13 skill, because she's a 4-star, I think she deserves it, Oz has a higher multiplier on his attack while also attacking a lot more frequently. So what's going on with Ineffa? that brings us to her A1 passive. If there are thunderclouds created by lunar charge reactions nearby when Birgitta unleashes a discharge attack, she will initiate an additional attack, dealing AoE electro damage equal to 65% of Ineffa's attack. Now, 65 doesn't sound like much of an increase on top of the already measly 172%, but it's the next sentence that really kicks this thing up into gear. This damage is considered lunar charge damage. Now, there's a lot of ways that lunar reaction damage is treated differently from regular talent damage, and when it comes to specifically lunar charge damage, one of those ways is that the multipliers just get tripled for some reason. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. It's a mystery. It's stupid. But this 65% is really more like 195% multiplier, which is already a lot more respectable, doubling the initial instance of damage. However, if we look at it in game, we can see, triggering a lunar charge, that lunar charge damage is much higher than the electro. About 5 times higher, so there must be something weird going on. On top of the multipliers being mysteriously 3 times higher than they look like they are, lunar charge talent damage gets similar properties to transformative reaction damage. First of which, it ignores enemy defense. Now, let's be clear, that is not enemy elemental resistance. Sets like VV and characters like Shilonen decrease enemy elemental resistance, which reaction damage and lunar charge talent damage is affected by, whereas Lisa, I think Lisa is the only unit that shreds defense in her base kit. Lisa decreases enemy defense. I think Razor also has a constellation that decreases enemy defense. These are 2 different stats, but by default, lunar charge damage does not get affected by enemy defense, which means they're just able to do more damage by default. The last main thing that I really want to talk about regarding lunar charge damage is that just like regular reaction damage, it isn't affected by any sort of damage bonus stat. Sets like Scroll giving elemental damage bonuses won't affect your character's lunar reaction damage. This also goes for generic damage bonuses, like the one given by Primordial Jadewing Spear, or damage bonuses to specific types of damage, like Golden Troop's elemental skill damage bonus. I don't think Ineffa's A1 passive damage is tagged as elemental skill damage, but even if it was, it wouldn't benefit from Golden Troop. Only this portion, the Birgitta Discharge, 172%, that's the only part that will get buffed by Golden Troop. But that doesn't mean they can't get damage bonus at all. Of course, both the new artifact set, Silken Moon Serenade and Night of the Skies Unveiling, both give specifically lunar reaction damage bonus, which of course is damage bonus specifically meant for lunar reactions. Ineffa's own signature gives lunar charge damage bonus. I believe Flins' does as well, although I could be wrong about that. But the other thing that gives you lunar reaction damage bonus is EM. Yes, because this damage is considered reaction damage, Elemental Mastery, the stat that increases your reaction damage, of course it increases lunar reaction damage. So even though her scalings don't have EM anywhere in them, she's a purely attack scaling character, EM can be a valuable damaging stat for her, not only because it affects her main source of damage, but because she is just going to be triggering some lunar charge reactions as a result of dealing damage. She's applying Electro herself, and she has triggering lunar charged as a condition to do her own personal damage, so of course you're just gonna get a little bit of damage from the lunar charge reaction itself. Alright, editing me here with one final little thing to say about Ineffa's A1 passive. Yes, you have to trigger lunar charge for her personal damage to come online, but the condition that Birgitta checks for this additional damage is just that there are thunderclouds nearby. After triggering lunar charge, a thundercloud will spawn and exist for about 5 or 6 seconds, which means that Ineffa's conditions for damage are pretty lax. You don't need to constantly be triggering burning. You don't need to be constantly triggering burning, oh my god. You don't need to constantly be triggering lunar charged. So this talent makes up the large majority of Ineffa's damage, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the artifact section, but of course because that main source of damage doesn't scale on damage bonus, that means she doesn't want damage bonus goblets. You're mainly going to be running attack on both her sands and her goblet. There are some gear dependent and team dependent situations where you could switch your main stats to EM, just one of them or both of them, or if you're really feeling crazy, all three. But generally, for a basic damaging Ineffa build, you are going to want to go attack, attack, crit, or to meet your energy needs, you can go ER, attack, crit, because she does have some energy needs. I'll get into that in a second. Finishing off with this talent, of course, the side thing that I didn't really mention that much is that she summons a shield, and this shield has pretty good scaling. Not the craziest, not the highest in the world, but because she's building so much attack, because she often has attack goblets, this attack scaling shield just gets that much stronger. Additionally, as you were looking, tenacity is a pretty good artifact set on her, which makes that shield even stronger. It's not unbreakable. I have had it pop if you just stand there and you don't bother dodging, you get hit by everything, even with a crown talent, even with tenacity. But as long as you're at least kind of paying attention, I find that this shield is often more than enough defensive utility. Both the shield and Brigitte have a 20-second duration, and the skill exists on a 16-second cooldown, giving you easy 100% uptime on the shield and the damage. So why does her burst resummon Brigitte? Now, the burst attributes aren't inherently awful. The multiplier is pretty decent, over 1,000 at just level 8, and it resummons Brigitte, but we just went over. Brigitte has 100% uptime with just her skill, and it's not like Brigitte is a static entity. She'll literally teleport underneath enemies whenever they need to be attacked. You're making me look stupid. You're making me look stupid. Get over here. This is literally the first time that this has ever happened. Brigitte, why are you doing this to me? Usually, like, she goes out of her way to attack enemies I'm not anywhere near, but the one time I'm trying to make a point out of this, of course she has to start acting up. Please? Thank you. Usually, yeah, she just teleports straight to enemies, so it's not like replacing will have any sort of positional effect. We also just went over that Ineffa primarily deals lunar-charged damage, so she doesn't build any damage bonus. So even though this burst does have a decent multiplier attached to it, that's a multiplier that does want damage bonus. Ineffa is also a fairly long uptime unit, so she tends to go first in rotations, and that burst doesn't catch any sort of buffs. So our big 1,000% multiplier only results in about 30k damage. Not particularly notable. So why does she even use her burst? What's the point of her energy needs? Of course, to figure that out, we gotta go back to her ascension passives. A4, very simple, provides an EM buff to both Ineffa and your onfielder based on Ineffa's attack. 6% of it, uncapped. So yeah, there it is. The burst itself isn't really useful. It doesn't do all that much on its own. It's just a means to access this EM buff, which is pretty meaningful. Not only does the EM affect Ineffa's own personal damage, as we just went over, but it buffs your onfielder, and Ineffa teams tend to trigger a lot of reactions, so elemental mastery becomes fairly valuable. At my level of investment, at around 2400 attack, this buff gives about 140 EM, which is a pretty meaningful amount. Also, kind of the last thing that I need to mention, which is more something that isn't in her kit, because of course she's a Nod Cry unit, she increases your party's moon sign, but because Ineffa came out in Natlan, she came out when moon sign didn't even exist. She is in the unique place of being a Nod Cry unit that can provide moon sign to a team, but doesn't ask for Ascendant Moongleam. She doesn't need another Nod Cry unit. Both Flins and Nefer are just hard restricted into Ascendant Moongleam. It's a requirement for them to do the large majority of their damage. Lauma's a little bit more freeing because she essentially has two different modes based on whether you're in Nascent or Ascendant Gleam, but the fact that they're mutually exclusive makes it so that her Ascendant Gleam buff can kind of muck up the Nascent Gleam buff in a team where you might want that, like a Nilou Bloom team. Even Columbina isn't going to be a unit that has much direct incentive to be an Ascendant Moongleam, but her kit does want other Nod Cry units in the team, triggering lunar reactions, doing lunar damage that she can buff. While her kit doesn't directly say that she needs to be an Ascendant Moongleam, in practice she is going to want to be an Ascendant Moongleam in most of her teams. Ineffa is unique in the way that she basically doesn't interface with the Moongleam mechanic at all. She has some artifact options that depend on Ascendant Moongleam, but because her kit was made before Moongleam was even a mechanic, she has far more flexibility in teams than a lot of the other Nod Cry units. So that's mostly it for her base kit. She summons a shield, she applies Electro, If you have Hydra on the team, then she'll deal a pretty significant amount of damage, which you want Hydra on the team. That's the main purpose of her. She buffs EM and she changes a reaction. And yes, on its face, her kit is simple, but just like Emily, the ways that she interacts with her designated reaction and how that can affect other units are really where the fine details of Ineffa come out to shine. So one final breakdown before we move on to the gear stuff. Ineffa's talent levels don't really matter that much at all. None of them contribute that significantly to her DPS because so much of her value is contained within her passive talents. The only one that I would really recommend leveling is the skill for the shield strength. Level it until you have a shield that you're comfortable working with, and then you're all set. Weapons first because they're boring. Her burst is important to her kit. Getting that EM buff is pretty impactful. That's why I pretty much always run engulfing on my Ineffa. Just a nice stat stick overall. It gives her a lot of things that she wants. But I started out using her pretty much solely on Katane. Katane has all stats that she really likes. It's a high base attack, it's EM, which she can use for her damage, and the elemental skill damage bonus, yeah, like I mentioned, lunar reaction damage doesn't scale on damage bonus, so this isn't affected. But its second effect can grant you 12 energy every 10 seconds as long as you're hitting an elemental skill, which, yeah, Ineffa does that a lot. Her usual requirements are around 160. I like to keep her at around 170 just for comfort. If you can consistently get Katane's passive to trigger, it's worth about 40% ER, which is just a lot of stats. My main issue is that flat energy restoration is on a 10-second cooldown. Ineffa often rotates in 16 seconds, which can cause your rotations to misalign with the cooldown on Katane and make it so that you don't always get enough energy. It can be a bit finicky, but it definitely deserves the mention for being a significantly powerful crafted option on her. Of course, there's the Nod Cry craftable, which gives a very similar amount of stats as Katane does, but instead of giving energy, it gives attack and lunar reaction damage bonus. So you'll just have to build the energy yourself in your artifacts. We have some decent older event weapons like the Torch, like Missive Wind Spear, Fav is never a bad idea. Moon Piercer can be a funny buffing option because she is functional in Hyperbloom teams, and this has the same base stats as Katane while also giving an attack buff. When it comes to the two Battle Pass weapons, Deathmatch and Ballad, they are extremely close to one another to the point where if you already have one of these at a decently high refine, you might not want to bother getting the other one to a similar level. But if you don't have either and you're looking to get one, or if you're like me and you have both and you just need to pick, Deathmatch is actually the better choice between the two. Like I mentioned, EM is one of the few stats that has actual diminishing returns, and she gets a fair amount of EM buffs in her teams. So the attack stats that Deathmatch gives actually make it a little bit more valuable. Onto the 5 stars, I mentioned that Engulfing is a decent stat stick. Jadewing does give attack in its passives, but it requires the user to be on field to build those stacks, so unless you're on fielding her, don't bother. Most of these other weapons are pretty much just stat sticks with some standout examples. Staff of Scarlet Sands takes your EM and converts it into attack. Those are both valuable damaging stats for Ineffa. Calamity's a lot of attack. Staff of Home was a decent amount of attack. Skyward Spine gives a nice smattering of stats that she likes. Attack, ER, crit. Her Sig is kind of interesting as a buffing weapon. It's not just personal damage for her, it's a full party 40% lunar charge damage bonus, which of course is useful for flins. It's useful for other teammates triggering lunar charge reactions. It's her best weapon. It's her best weapon. One more that I want to go back to that I slid past was Sacrificer's Staff. This is a fairly recent gacha weapon that looks like it was almost handmade for Ineffa, if not for all the other polearm units that use the exact same stats and conditions as her. High base attack, crit rate substat, gives you attack percent and ER when you hit with her skill. Those are all just good stats that she is a big fan of. Finally, moving on to artifacts. Ineffa is finally getting a best in slot artifact set, but I'm still not personally 100% sold on it. In 6.3, we are getting Albad, I don't know how to pronounce that word, of Morning Star and Moon, which is essentially just a lunar reaction version of Golden Troop. Lunar reaction damage bonus, but you get more if you're off field. This is Ineffa's best damaging set. This is going to be the option that is optimal in a lot of teams just because of how much damage Ineffa deals. But it, unlike Ineffa, does have an Ascendant Gleam requirement. So she's not going to be able to use this set in a lot of teams where she is the only Nod Cry unit. And To be fair, Columbina is going to make those teams very few and far between, as a lot of the teams I show off today would be improved by putting Columbina in the Hydro slot, but we'll get to that. In any case, this is clearly Ineffa's best in slot damage set, but it's far from her only set. Between our two 20% attack sets, Tenacity and Noblesse, she can't make use of Noblesse's 2-piece bonus, and the 4-piece bonus, only having a 12-second duration, makes it so that it actually has some downtime in her teams because she goes first in so many of her rotations. Tenacity provides pretty much the exact same stats with 100% uptime and some extra shield strength. For a unit that actually has a shield, that's pretty meaningful. She also has another supportive set option in Serenade. Unlike Tenacity, its 2-piece actually does give pretty useful stats for her, and she of course meets the very easy requirements of dealing elemental damage to activate the 4-piece bonus. With Ineffa's new DPS set, it's pretty unlikely that running Silken Moon or Tenacity is the optimal choice, but I mentioned Silken Moon because, I mean, number one, just a lot of people have asked about it, and even if it's not optimal, it is a good thing you can do. And we've had more time to farm Silken Moon. The new set is just about to come out, and it's likely that you'll have a good Silken Moon set that can still work on Ineffa and deal a decent bit of damage while you're farming up her new artifact set. Tenacity is much more of a utility set, because while the stats that it gives usually aren't as valuable as the ones given by the other two sets that we've mentioned, unlike Serenade and Morningstar, it doesn't have an Ascendant Moongleam requirement, and in general, more units can make use of the 20% attack that Tenacity gives than the 120 EM and the 10% Lunar reaction damage bonus that Serenade gives. And of course it has that shield strength. So there's your general priority. Morningstar for damage, Serenade as a supportive option in her more meta Nod Cry teams, Tenacity as a sort of utility buffing option, that also works in non-Ascendant Moongleam teams. We're finally done focusing on Ineffa herself. Let's open up these teams. Starting, of course, with Flins. Now, Ineffa and Flins have a very similar relationship to Emily and Kaniche, where Emily doesn't really support Kaniche as much as they're just two DPSs that have the same conditions for dealing damage. So it's less about all the things that Ineffa does to buff Flins, and more about just finding units that can mutually buff both Ineffa and Flins and get them both dealing substantial damage. Now let's get some artifacts on these guys. Alright, editing Mies out here. I got the good mic out, so you know this is gonna be a long one. I don't really think okay, alright, let's move. I don't think I really hit what I wanted to say about Flins and Ineffa on the head with my original recording. Did a lot of talking, but not a lot of saying, if you know what I mean. I think Flins and Ineffa are very interesting and incredibly well-designed characters because they are each other's best teammates, but they also don't feel incomplete at all without each other. Even though people think of Ineffa as Flins' dedicated support, she really doesn't do much to buff him. She has her EM buff, and she increases the base damage of lunar-charged reactions, which includes talent damage. But if we're counting this as a buff, he also does the exact same thing for her, because he has the exact same passive. The only real buff that Ineffa's giving him is EM, and she's giving that exact same buff to herself. They set each other up to both deal a lot of damage. That's what their teams are about. Units that can buff both of them at the same time. And actually, Ino isn't a unit that can do that. She buffs single target. That's why Columbina is going to be replacing Ino in these teams. She doesn't even have better buffs than C6 Ino. She just has party-wide buffs and a lot of personal damage. They buff each other, but they also don't feel lacking without each other. Ineffa doesn't give overly specific buffs. She just gives EM and she does a lot of her own damage. Flins just has the damage within his own kit. He mostly just gives up the quality of life of her shield, but I consider Flins to be a particularly strong defensive unit that doesn't always need dedicated defensive options. His infused normals don't do very much damage, so unlike with other characters, you're pretty free to dodge around and you won't lose DPS, and all of his actual damage is contained within his mini bursts, a period which he is entirely invincible. I've said in the past that without Ineffa, Flins can lack decent defensive options in his teams, but the more I play Flins, the more I find out that he is uniquely positioned as a unit who can freely dodge around and with good enough timing, avoid a lot of damage. So Ineffa's one real quality of life feature is a feature that Flins, with enough experience, can go without. So those are my total thoughts on Flins and Ineffa. They position themselves as each other's best buffers, and they do have an incredibly comfortable and high damage team, but they also feel like complete units without each other. Alright, cutting back to say some more stuff about lunar charge. As I mentioned, lunar charge is a reaction that calculates the damage that every contributing unit would deal, and then applies that damage appropriately based on which units are dealing the most damage. As I mentioned, it takes crit into account, so if the formula prioritizes units who contribute more damage, and it takes crit into account, that means it prioritizes the damage of the units that would crit. That means if you apply your element with one unit who does get a crit, and you trigger the reaction with a second unit who doesn't get a crit because she literally cannot crit, it prioritizes the higher damage of the unit that did crit, and it counts the entire reaction as a crit. Now, Kokomi is the only unit in the game who, by default, cannot crit, so this only really works for enabling crits altogether on Kokomi herself, but universally it lets you trigger the effects of Fav without having to build any crit at all. Even if we look at an Ino who has no artifacts on at all, she has no increased crit rate, through lunar charge's crit mechanics, you can almost always guarantee a Fav proc on her. And of course, not only can you use this for Fav to get extra energy, but if you really feel like doing something stupid, you can potentially do an Ino build with no crit rate, all crit damage, that gives her majority ownership of the lunar charge reactions. Now, that sounds like a lot of work for what probably isn't going to amount to much damage, but Ino can't really be built for anything anyways. She only really has her burst. She doesn't deal any sort of personal damage, and she doesn't have any buffs that are attached to her own stats. So if you have the pieces to build reaction DPS Ino with no crit rate, all crit damage, you might as well. Now, that's it about the lunar charge reaction itself, but we do have one more little thing to talk about before we get into all the teams. Who can we use as a stand-in? You know what? We'll run Dahlia. Just pretend he's Columbina. Alright, editing me's back. That was much faster than I would have liked. But this next section, when I start talking about Columbina, I am strictly talking about meta applications and meta teams. I think it's important that I preface this because that's not something that I normally do. I have some negative asterisk things to say about Columbina, but a lot of these things only apply to the better teams that she's running. Her basic properties make her a very flexible hydro applier and a somewhat interesting geo enabler, but this is the Ineffa video, so I mostly want to talk about how Columbina relates to Ineffa, which is mostly meta stuff. Now, I feel like I've kind of already talked about most of the things I wanted to say, just kind of split up between sections, because I've already said that Columbina would be an improvement to pretty much every single team that I'm going to show off today. Is that because Columbina is such an inherently strong and busted unit? No. It's because I'm showing off a bunch of Ineffa teams. Ineffa is a lunar charge DPS, she has Hydra requirements, and Columbina is a Hydra unit that is specifically designed to apply Hydra 4 and buff Nod Cry units. She literally buffs lunar reaction damage bonus in her burst. You don't run Columbina because she's good by herself, you run Columbina because Ineffa's there, and Columbina makes Ineffa better. She's gonna be a fine unit at a baseline, she deals some decent Hydra damage in AoE, she enables all the lunar reactions and introduces lunar crystallize to the game, which we're just getting. You can have fun with her outside of teams that don't have another Nodcry 5-star, but it does take another Nodcry 5-star to kick Columbina up to the level of being busted, and in so many teams, that unit is Ineffa. So I can make a very strong case for Ineffa being the more valuable unit to pull, especially if you don't have any other Nod Cry units and you haven't been investing this year. Now, if you want Columbina because you just like Columbina as a character, you want to see her float around and be pretty, but so much of Columbina's strength comes from Ineffa that if you primarily care about the strength of your account, I would maybe recommend going for Ineffa first, because she's already incredibly strong and versatile, and getting Columbina is just going to amplify that. Columbina is really more of an Ineffa and also a Lauma constellation. I mean, if I were making this video about Lauma, I would probably have most of the same things to say, but I like Ineffa a lot more as a unit, so this video isn't about Lauma. But a lot of the same things apply to her. Columbina's strength isn't necessarily in the strength of her kit, it's how she enables Lauma and Ineffa, Ineffa, and of those two, I find Ineffa to be far more versatile. So finally, there we are. We're done talking about our first team. I have no idea how far into the video we are. This is very much your bog standard Flins team. I don't really have many other variations of this because, like I mentioned, all that Flins really needs is a good defensive option, and Ineffa provides that on top of being a good buffer for him and a good sub DPS. I don't really need to go that deep into team variations on Flins and Ineffa. Most of them pretty much play exactly the same. I generally just prefer to go with this. This is his best team. I find it to be his most comfy, so let's just do a run of it. See how it rotates, even though it should be self-explanatory. I know that this Abyss is like AoE centric, but I guess we can show off both Ineffa and Flins' AoE strength here, because I kind of did very briefly mention that Ineffa has very good AoE on her attacks, but I think it just needs to be said again. Or maybe I don't need to say it, maybe I just need to show it. Oh dear, frame rate.
Preparing for Bustle. Cleanup sequence.
Be silent. Nightfall. Close your eyes. Fear is dark. The night cometh.
Ultimatum protocol.
Be silent. Close your eyes. Night falls. The long sleep beckons.
Preparing for Bustle. Defensive mode.
Well, I passed TTDS to Ino there by accident because I was like, maybe I can just survive off of Ino E as my only Hydra application for the rotation, and then I changed my mind. I wanted the burst. But yeah, first attempt, 1 minute 15 seconds. Not too bad for an Abyss floor that wasn't particularly designed to be good for Flins and Ineffa. I mean, it's an AoE check, and they have very, very strong AoE, but it's a bit more of a grouping check, and I didn't have very much strong grouping on that team. I had Sucrose, but I only used Sucrose's burst on her first rotation. Because we have a million billion enemies, and enemies drop energy particles, that you got to see a little bit more of like big burst Flynn stuff, where if he gets excess energy, he can get a lot of extra motion value out by using his big burst, but that gets a lot more into Flynn stuff. That is another thing that Ineffa provides, although it feels like less of a thing that Ineffa provides and more just a restriction that she fulfills for him. Because Flynn's is energy reliant, Ineffa generating consistent off-field particles is really nice, and she provides him electro resonance, which gets extra particles upon triggering reactions. He's energy reliant, she helps a lot. I mean, the reason that Ineffa's good with Flynn's is mostly the same reason that she's good with a unit like Cyno. They're dual EM and attack scalers, and Ineffa gives EM. They're both energy reliant, and Ineffa provides electro resonance and particles of her own. She gives them both good defensive options. She provides a lot of her own damage on top of what they do. You know what? I might just test this team out in Abyss and see how far I can get, see if I can get a similar clear time. Cyno isn't really working nearly as well. I've tried this 1 or 2 times, and the issue is just that because, as I mentioned, this is a grouping check, what kind of Flins does to bypass that grouping check is he just kills the enemies before they can get the chance to ungroup themselves. So when you have even kind of smaller, I mean, you know, Cyno is doing significantly less damage than Flins, but even like small changes in DPS in this chamber can be pretty significant, because just giving the enemies just that much time to like let them ungroup themselves and make it so that you're not hitting multiple enemies at once, that can add a lot of extra time onto each wave. But also, Cyno is just doing a lot less damage because Cyno is a much older unit. My point is that the DPS difference between Cyno and Flins is probably not as massive as you think. Come on. Unless when you get a cryo applied on Cyno and he can't do his normal attacks at any reasonable speed. And when you can't find an enemy to do Shilona normals on. God. Yeah, this is not gonna go well. I've had some better clears, but this one is not gonna go particularly well because of how restrictive this abyss is. Let's do it against a single target boss and just see how it works. Certainly takes a little bit more time than Flins does. I'll do a little Flins clear to compare. Come on, kill him. Oh, come on. I didn't even get it in one rotation. I'm such a fraud. All right, I realized I messed up my gear in my recording, so I just wanted to do a re-recording of my cyno clear versus Flins clear while putting cyno in basically the exact same gear as Flins had. Yeah, that went a lot better. I was like struggling to one rotate. Flins can, you know, chunk this boss a lot easier just because that's the nature of his damage. He does front-loaded damage, but realistically, it took most of Flins' rotation to kill that boss. It happened faster because Flins can front-load his damage, and also, as we talked about, Flins is sort of buffing Ineffa by nature of this talent. He's increasing her lunar charge base damage as well. I'm saying all this as if Cyno isn't significantly worse than Flins. Cyno is significantly worse than Flins. I just want to be clear about why he's worse than Flins. I'm also being a little bit unfair to him because obviously Cyno was made with Dendro stuff in mind, and we don't have any Dendro stuff going on in this team. If we do a little switchy swappy, we do something that is far more suited to Cyno himself. And this is possible without Lauma. You can really run any sort of Dendro offfielder, Nahida, Baiju. I've actually swapped to DMC a few times recently, but too lazy to go to the statue now, but DMC works just fine if you can meet his energy needs, which are kind of awful. But like Yao Yao, Kirara, Kole, they all work. Just Lauma is the best, and also because she is a Nod Cry unit, she gives Cyno access to Night Sky's Unveiling as a set. I mean, realistically, I also could have used this in the last team that had Ino in it, but the fact that I didn't swap helps me talk about the interaction. Thundering Fury gives you cooldown reduction when you trigger an Electro reaction, so it can be a good DPS set on a unit like Cyno who can use it to get more skills out. But outside of Quicken, it can be pretty hard to guarantee that he gets a ton of Thundering Fury procs and he can consistently lower his cooldown. But Lunar Charge having that shared damage property makes it much easier for Cyno to consistently get the effects of this set and get his cooldown reduced and get more skills out. Still, if you can, you probably should just be using Night Sky's Unveiling. So let's see how well we can make this work. Yeah, much better. How much of it was Cyno? Stop asking questions. You're better off not knowing. Still having that same, like, base problem with Flins that I said. But this actually, this helps me make my point much better because, as we saw, this team is still very, very good. How much of that Cyno's doing is up to debate, but it does a lot of damage. It works very, very well in single target, but in a context like this, because the enemies are given time to ungroup, yeah, it slows down and it performs a lot worse. Especially when it comes to these guys, if you don't get them down immediately, if you're not able to take care of their health bars, they generate these cryo shields that makes it much more difficult to kill them. Yeah, I'm almost 2 minutes into the run and I'm not even done with her. our Cryo Fatui mages. I guess this is just an extension of my point of how good Flins and Ineffa are in AoE together. Because when you take a team that still performs very well, but is mostly a single target team in an abyss like this, it performs so much worse. Now that I've spent all this time talking about cyno, let's talk about better cyno. I actually already said most of the things that I have to say about Sethos about cyno, but it's Sethos. I gotta show off Sethos. Also, he's on banner, so yippee, relevant. Because I did quickbloom stuff with cyno, I'm actually more inclined to swap back to Sucrose and do more dedicated lunar-charged things with Sethos, especially because I find him to be a much less compelling hyperbloom trigger than cyno is. He has much smaller AoE, he just has a harder time triggering hyperblooms, and he does a lot more EM scaling talent damage than cyno does, so Ineffa's buff. So for cyno, Ineffa's EM buff is more just a buff to his reactions because his actual talent scalings on EM are not really that significant. Sethos has far better EM scalings, so the EM buff is less wasted if he's not contributing to reactions as much. Do I just like, because Sethos is not an attack scaling character, do I just like TTDS and pass it back to Ineffa and then swap to Sethos? I guess so. Hi Ineffa. Alright, it's Sethos time. Oh, sorry guys. I'm being a fraud. Please. Thank you. I didn't want Sethos to look like a fraud that couldn't one rotate. Although that is a me issue. That's just what happens every time I do a Sethos showcase. I play too many different units and I don't get enough practice with Sethos, so that I just do bad rotations. Sorry everybody. Better Sethos play is absolutely possible, and better clears are absolutely possible if you have better play. But I have been playing a lot of Venti, so I actually do have N2 cancels ingrained into my muscle memory. They're just not N2 walk cancels, they're N2 aim cancels, so I'm like messed up. Oh my god, you can do these so fast on Sethos. Man, I wish I could do aim cancels on Sethos, that would be so much fun.
Preparing for Defensive mode.
Maybe I do this.
Excuse me?
There we go, I didn't even need my third charge shot, which generally you shouldn't need because his energy needs, I don't think, allow for a third charge shots, at least on this build. But of course, Sethos is Sethos. If you want to build more energy recharge, if you want to get more charge shots out of your rotation, you can do that! Just like Flins with his big burst. Now, what do we have next? I set up a bunch of teams usually for 101s, and I just kind of go down the line, go through them, but I always forget the order that I put them in, so let's see who's next. Oh, it's Lyney. Hi, Lyney. This brings us on to overvape, which is one of my favorite Ineffa contexts. So a fun little thing about both electrocharge and lunar charge, as most of you probably know at this point, they don't immediately consume both auras upon triggering the reaction. So it's possible, and in fact probable, that enemies will have both auras on them, both hydro and electro, for pretty much your entire rotation, at least in doing regular electrocharge and lunar charge teams. Really, where this becomes interesting is the fact that units can react with both auras. I don't want to go too into the weeds about elemental gauge, but essentially, when pyro units hit an enemy that's affected by the electrocharge aura, they'll react with the electro first and trigger an overload, but they'll still apply enough pyro to react with the hydro and trigger a vaporize, increasing the damage of the hit. However, because elements are applied in distinct units in this game, reacting with electro takes some of the pyro, so by triggering an overload and a vaporize at the same time, they consume less hydro and can survive with worse hydro application. So electro effectively protects what hydro aura you have when you're triggering vaporizes, and lets you get more vaporizes with less hydro. Farina by herself has fairly inconsistent hydro application, as does Lyney. Hers is staggered because her summons attack at different speeds. His is staggered because his damage is staggered. He applies pyro fast and quickly when he does his charge shots. Including any electro in the team makes her hydro aura much more consistent and makes it easier to regain a hydro aura after you've lost it. So Ineffa, being a unit that does a bunch of damage that also has a shield that Lyney really appreciates that also buffs EM, which affects both his overload and his vaporize triggers. That's just a bunch of extra nice stuff on top. I also promised that I would talk about Jahoda, and I just want to talk about Jahoda because I haven't really been able to talk about her in video form yet. I've used Shilonen in the slot in the past, and overall I still think I prefer Shilonen, but I want to have at least a few free-to-play alternatives. I don't want to just be all 5 stars this video. And also, yeah, I want to talk about Jahoda, and Farina and Ineffa gives me a pretty good excuse to. I mostly talked about this in my Aoife 101, but Farina and Ineffa are both just fairly good units on their own. The only issue is that they're not good units for each other. Really, the only synergy between them is that Farina applies Hydro for Ineffa to deal her damage. Otherwise, they're not that useful to each other. All of Ineffa's supportive stuff pretty much only affects your on-fielder, and Farina drains your health and asks that you bring a healer. But if you do that, if you listen to her and you do bring a healer, then she buffs damage bonus, which isn't useful to Ineffa. Jahoda's still not the perfect glue to hold them together, but she comes close. She of course is an Animo unit, and through the use of VV, she can shred res, but she's also a Nod Cry unit, and she's a healer. And a particularly good healer for Farina at that. She specifically will heal the character with the lowest HP in the team, which Farina has a lot of incentives in her kit to keep your entire party above 50%. Jahoda is particularly good at healing low party members, even if they drop to below 50% and immediately swap off field, which Jahoda herself is particularly good at doing. But yeah, she's good at meeting Farina's healing requirements, and she's a Nod Cry unit, and while Ineffa herself doesn't have any sort of Ascendant Moongleam requirements. That was weird. I don't know if you guys saw that. I pressed escape twice really fast, and I like immediately went from this screen to like zoomed out. There was no transition. I'm gonna stop getting distracted. Ineffa herself doesn't have any Moongleam requirements, but Jahoda being in the team gives other units the opportunity to use Nod Cry sets. Like maybe instead of using Lyney, maybe you're using Hu Tao, who doesn't have a particularly great set. Running Jahoda to enable Night Sky's Unveiling on Hu Tao can be valuable, and also Hu Tao is good to talk about here, because usually, like I said, I tend to just run Tenacity, but running Jahoda allows Ineffa to use either of her Ascendant Moongleam sets, whether you want to use Silken to buff Hu Tao, because Hu Tao isn't really an attack scaler, she likes the EM buff from Serenade a lot more. If you want to use Serenade to buff Hu Tao, because she's not an attack scaler, not at least directly. If you just want to use the new DPS set on Ineffa, Jahoda enables that. And Ineffa also does a little bit for Jahoda. Jahoda's main weakness that a lot of people have pointed out is the fact that she has pretty decent on-field times, at least if you're trying to fill her treasure flask, which filling her treasure flask gives her one of her sources of off-field application, and it's also how she activates her crit buff at C6 that buffs nearby moon sign characters, and would you believe it, Ineffa is a nearby moon sign character. But to fill that flask, she has this very long running animation where she needs to slowly fill this meter, and she's particularly vulnerable to attacks while she does it. She has decent interruption resistance during the skill, but I have been knocked out of it, and if you are knocked out of it, no particles, no damage, no application, just nothing. It just goes on cooldown and screw yourself. In any case, even if you don't get interrupted during her skill, Jahoda just has pretty low base defensive stats. Before my Jahoda was level 90, it wasn't uncommon for her to just get pulverized in the middle of her skill because of how long it takes and how vulnerable she is during the animation. And I've spent all this time going over all of Jahoda's weaknesses just to say, Ineffa give big shield. She makes it much easier to get the whole filled treasure flask uninterrupted, and makes it so that Jahoda doesn't get turned into mincemeat if the enemy even so much as looks at her. This is just becoming an impromptu Jahoda video because I never talked about Jahoda in any of my videos, but I'm almost done. Technically, you can just tap the skill twice and forego filling the treasure flask, because all she needs to really be good is to be a Nod Cry unit that increases moon sign, be an Animo unit that can shred res, and be a healer that can be a defensive unit or a Farina check. The application is nice if you can get it, and the buff at C6 is nice if you can get it, but neither are wholly necessary. Anyways, let's stop talking and let's just play the team. Also, because Serenade doesn't have to be equipped to a Nod Cry unit, you could throw it on whatever unit you want in this team. I suggested Ineffa, but I'm putting it on Farina because my Serenade build is bad, and I want my Ineffa to be dealing damage. Time for another entry in the Mies doesn't have the proper artifacts leveled for the things that they want to show off, So we get a little bit of free artifact gambling in the middle of an unrelated video. Woo, flat attack. Woo, flat attack. Woo, flat attack. And even that, look at that. Alone, Farina by herself would absolutely not have enough Hydra to keep up with C1 Hu Tao in particular. It's possible that you can get away with the C0 Hu Tao, but C1 just applies so much more pyro. I was honestly impressed there. I think Jahoda was necessary because Jahoda was also supplementing with Hydra application, and that's why maybe in this particular variant with Hu Tao, I prefer Jahoda over Shilonen, whereas another unit like Lyney, who still has, like I mentioned, that staggered application. It's staggered and it's weird, so you still want electrocharge going on just to consistently get your vapes, but it's not nearly as just much as Hu Tao's is, so you don't need as much raw application like Jahoda is helping with. That was actually kind of really fun, so I maybe want to do that again. This might be my new favorite Hu Tao team. Let's just test our theory and let's not use Jahoda. Like, let's not fill the treasure flask. Let's just do a little double E. Because her burst still does a little bit of off-field application. It was getting a little rough near the end there. It kind of did the first time as well. But I think I was pretty consistently getting my vapes off. So yippee, yoo-ha, would you look at that? I don't want to bait all the Lyney fans, so let's just look at the Lyney variation of it too. But realistically, it shouldn't be that much different. I'll do one run with Jahoda, one with Shilonen. And because I'm running Farina and a healer, then I can run Marashose no problem, and nobody in the comments will complain about Marashose being bad on Lyney. I also just really enjoy this as a Lyney team that is not circle impacted at all. Hu Tao doesn't really have teams that are circle impacted, so it's not really a feature for her, but Lyney is pretty heavily tied to Bennett, so Ineffa giving him some good teams outside of Bennett makes him just feel a lot better in my opinion. Like, look at that, nice and beautiful. Let's try it on a higher health target, because I feel like with Lyney you do need a longer rotation to get a better sense of how it works. Have you respawned yet? You have respawned, yay! Get up, Bronzelock, wake up! Only like 5 more days until we get test dummies in Miliastra, but until then, you are my target. Again, I don't really need to be doing the long E with Jahoda here. Okay. I don't know if this is just like I don't know what I'm supposed to be rotating on, or like how much time I'm supposed to be rotating in, but Ineffa ER needs, this is kind of showing me that my ER needs might not be met in this team. Yeah, okay, they might just not be met in this team. What is my current ER? 160? This kind of brings me back to the point where, yes, Ineffa provides electro resonance, she provides electro particles for flins, but also she herself has energy needs, and she also really likes electro resonance. It's not just good for him, it's good for her as well. So in teams where you don't do double electro, it can be a decent bit harder to get your needs, especially if you aren't getting your fav procs. I think I've missed 1 or 2 on these rotations. But this still gives you a basic idea of the team. Now let's just swap out for Shilonen. Oh wow. I think that was just like unlucky. Yeah. Why does it feel like with Shilonen? I mean, yeah, I know Jahoda was providing her own application, but it feels like with Shilonen it's just so much easier to get a pyro aura and miss my vapes on Lyney, which that's bad. I don't want to do that. Like there, maybe I should have waited a second to get my vaporize off, but that's actually really funny. This seems to be like markedly more consistent with Jahoda. That's a big surprise to me, but I guess you go, girl, you go, Jahoda. Even with her whole long skill thing, it just feels better in the execution. So we have a Jahoda win, woo! Now we've looked at one side of overvape for the onfielders. Let's take a look at the other side. Durin is another unit that has just come out, who, when triggering pyro reactions, he will shred res for both elements involved in the reaction, as long as those elements aren't hydro or cryo. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Ineffa is neither hydro nor cryo. I'm not going to spend that much time on Durin, because most of what I talked about in the on-fielder section of overvape applies here. It's just that he's not on field. But because of his res shred and her damage, they make up a pretty solid core for overvape carries of either electro or pyro elements. Right now, we're looking at electro, and just for the sake of variety, I threw raiden in here. You know what? Do I want to run Ino in here, or is there another more interesting unit that I can use? I could potentially use Mona to enable the Hexen Circle stuff. Because of course, this team just replacing raiden with flins is one of Flins's best teams. You can look into my Durin video if you want to see more about that, but raiden is serving a pretty similar role to flins here. She just is doing a lot less damage. She's more of a utility unit, which is what I appreciate her a lot for. She's on fielding, she's doing a bit of damage, and she's also making much better use of Mona's damage bonus buffs than flins ever did, because her damage actually scales on damage bonus. Now, do I take engulfing away from Ineffa for this? Nah, let's put her on catch.
Shine down. Annihilation mode. Story of only delving to destiny, written in the stars. Now you shall perish.
I'm kind of in a weird corner here, so I feel like it's weirdly difficult to see what's going on. I think I missed my crit on her initial hit of her burst. But this is doing fairly well. It got most of the progress in my first rotation. Alright, let's get out of here so we don't kill him, so that if we want him back, then he'll respawn. Again, raiden is just kind of a stand-in. I'm using her for the sake of variety here. Any electro carry works here. Most pyro carries will function. It's a little bit iffy. If you're running Durin, you have to make sure that you have enough sources of off-field hydro and electro, so someone like Mona just might not work as well. You might want to run a Yelan, you might want to run a Farina if you can. Yeah, how about that? Prototype Amber Veresa and Farina. There's your stupid Veresa team idea. Do with that what you will. But when using electro carries, you don't really need to worry about your auras as you're constantly reapplying electro, so Mona will work just perfectly fine. The next team is a little bit evil, I'll admit. This one isn't one that I'm going to spend an incredible amount of time on, but I'm so sorry, Ineffa. Her damage contribution is the main thing that she brings to a team, and she does have hydro requirements to do that damage, but like, the rest of her kit still works, even if you don't bring hydro. She still has her shield, she still has electro application once every 2 seconds in AoE. That's not terribly bad, especially if you put a little bit of EM on her and let her trigger some big overloads or something. She still has an EM buff, which can potentially be useful in an overload team. She's not doing all the ridiculous damage that her kit is meant to do, but it's not like Toma's that much better. The inherent attributes of her kit without the damage are still somewhat reasonable, and I think are still enough to warrant being used in overload teams just as a defensive option. It's just a better version of EM Tenacity Raiden because she also has a shield. I'll do one quick rotation just on Aeon Blight Drake to look at this.
Annihilation mode. Justice will prevail. Leave it to me. Let's get this show on the road. Step right up.
Clean, simple, free. it's clearly not the best use case for your Ineffa. There are probably going to be teams that you can find her more useful on. But I just want to do my little daily reminder that you don't always need to play units in their intended best ways. They can still hold a lot of value just looking at the kind of other attributes of their kit. And this is a perfectly functional use case for Ineffa. And while it seems like Hoyo is kind of doing less and less enemies with innate auras in endgames, this is an incredibly viable strategy against Tulpa, where you can meet both your requirements for a full overload team for Chevy to shred res, and you can meet your Hydra requirements for Ineffa to deal damage. And of course, you get your free vapes on your pyro units. God, this is horrible. I didn't delete him as fast as I would have liked, but the last off-field Ineffa team I want to show off is, again, probably going to be a shorter one. And it's not just overload teams that can use Ineffa in a non-lunar charge context. It's also nefer teams, and she's actually pretty good there, mostly because there isn't a ton of competition. This is pretty much the same concept as this overload team. Ineffa isn't getting much lunar charged uptime. Ino is here, and you can occasionally get some lunar charges, but generally the Dendro from Nefer and Laumar are going to eat it up and make it so that Ineffa is only triggering aggravates. But she still provides the big stupid shield. She still triggers Quicken, which lets you get some extra DPS through spread on your Nefer teams. And of course, she has that EM buff. So by giving her a full attack build on Serenade, you get a combination shielder and EM buffer that activates Quicken, which there isn't a ton of things that Nefer is doing with the last slot in her teams anyways. Back to Nuzlocke so we can look at some damage. Okay, cool, I didn't accidentally kill him before.
Preparing for Bustle. We must be with one heart. No more love. Can I the truth? The deception ends here.
Look at that. And, alright, I still don't have enough energy on Ineffa, but whatever, we won't worry about that. I'm actually kind of inclined to try this in Abyss, because I actually think that Nefer is a decent AoE DPS. Not as good as Flins, but she's reasonable. I am supposed to be live streaming in 10 minutes. I don't think I'm making that live stream.
Installation chamber deployed. Chorus, protect us. By the trust. No more love. The mystery unravels.
This guy's over here. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I was talking about how minor changes in DPS can significantly affect clear times in this chamber. Because now I just have this one guy who is standing back and has decided to not get hit by anything. And he is going to significantly affect how fast I'm able to get through this.
Deception ends here.
And like her, yeah, see? During my burst animation, I gave one of the season mages time to step back. I still, like, it's a decent DPS team, and I think I'm going to be able to get through this in probably less than 90 seconds. I might take 1 or 2 resets, which the Flins team did not, but that's also, I play a decent amount more Flins than I do Nefer. And the cryo is horrible and messing me up. Why does cryo slow every single animation? That's such an awful mechanic. Yeah, never mind. The season mages have ruined everything by doing exactly what I said they would do. And this, oh, the knockback. The fact that they get knocked back by like everything. I don't think I'm allowed to burst against these guys. I've just made this video about clearing this floor with Nefer. I'm not even bothering doing like charge cancels on Nefer just because like I think the consistency in just like making sure that I hit the enemies and making sure I don't do any kind of weird stuff. I think that's more important. Okay, I know I'm not supposed to burst, but they were near death, so I thought that was okay. This is going much better. Alright, well, it was a little shorter than 90 seconds, but honestly, like, with not perfect play, I'll take that clear. I'll take, what was that, minute 40 seconds? I'll take minute 40 seconds. Alright, and then the last team is probably going to take a little bit more time to talk about, so third recording session, woo! Candace is a pretty interesting option for an off-field hydro applier, but before C6 her application is a little strange, because she doesn't actually get any direct application herself. The only application she gives is by nature of her burst giving an infusion, so she gives other characters the ability to apply hydro while she's off-field. Of course you can just use that to make Ineffa your on-fielder and have her applying her own hydro, and even run someone like Bennett to give her a big attack buff, make her deal more damage, and Bennett's C6 actually doesn't ruin this interaction. Candace's Hydro Infusion takes precedent over Bennett's Pyro Infusion. However, that's not really what I like to do with Candace. So this is kind of a video that I bagged and I never really made, but I guess now it's coming into the Ineffa 101. I like Gaming a lot. I appreciate Gaming, but unfortunately, Gaming doesn't appreciate me. Mine has only ever been C1, and while C0 Gaming isn't an unusable unit, his constellations are incredibly helpful to making him into the powerhouse that he can become. A few of his constellations offer pretty minor damage upgrades, and of course his notorious C6 is a mind-boggling 80 crit value, and with all his constellations he punches well above his weight class, taking on many limited 5 stars in terms of DPS. But a really big constellation that a lot of people overlook is C4. Gaming is a burst reliant DPS, and this constellation does a lot to help fix his energy needs. Without this, his needs are significantly higher. Depending on team, it can get upwards of 180 ER. These needs alone make him pretty difficult to build and not always worth it, but lucky us, a few patches back, we got an event weapon that gives Elemental Mastery, which is a useful damage stat for Gaming, at least if he's reacting his damage, which he is in this team, and he usually does. It also gives flat energy, and a lot of it. Don't get me wrong, this is not a particularly good team, because it still is relying on the damage of effectively a C0 Gaming. His C1 doesn't increase his damage in any way. The reason why I think I never made a standalone video about this is it's not a great team, it's really just one that gets a C0 Gaming functioning and doing somewhat reasonable damage. But Gaming is still fairly reliant on his constellations to succeed. It also is reliant on a limited time event weapon, so I feel like I kind of missed my opportunity to make a dedicated video about it. But Gaming's on banner, and Ineffa helps make it a lot more consistent, so we're bringing it back. We're talking about it here. Like, does it do a lot of damage? No. Part of that is due to my investment in Gaming. I could get him level 90'd, I could get his skill crowned, and I intend to do both of those things once I maybe get a few more constellations on him. But it works. He gets his burst back, and on this build, don't look at the crit stats, don't worry about the crit stats, but he's only rocking 120 ER, which is usually only enough if you have C4, and often only enough if you have another pyro unit in the team. He has neither, but he is consistently getting his burst back. Other than that, this is just a pretty standard Gaming overvape team, and if you have a better invested Gaming with more constellations, you can just drop the Flame-Forged Insight for a better performing weapon. You know what, let's do him with the Mara Chaussee build. I think this might treat him a lot better, because I realized my two-piece options were just not it.
Ultimatum protocol. Heal. We shall preparing for Bustle. Clean up
I did a little bit of juggling there. I hope all you Gaming mains who follow me for some reason, even though I never talk about him, are proud of me. But yeah, this is a fun little Gaming team. It's basically the only one that works on my account. But if you have Gaming C4, if you have a better built Gaming, then you can run a different unit other than Candace. You don't have to use the event weapon, and it's still a functional and comfy overvape team. Now, the final team for today goes back to the very first thing I mentioned in this video. Ineffa's normal attacks. Really, it's less of a property of the normal attacks themselves and more how the rest of her kit allows her to use her normal attacks. Because as we've been over, Ineffa doesn't build damage bonus. Her main damaging stats that she builds are attack and EM. Because she doesn't build any specific elemental damage bonus, that means she can convert her normal attacks into different elements and still get the value of all the stats that she builds. So, plop her in a team with a C6 Bennett, she gets a major attack buff, she gets a healer, and she also gets her normal attacks converted over to Pyro, and because she has Hydro as a condition to be dealing her damage, she can turn herself into the overvape carry. Throw her in a team with Farina to make use of Bennett's healing and give her more damage bonus because, of course, she doesn't build any damage bonus and her normal attacks would like a little bit of damage bonus. Last slot is flexible. I chose Durin as my res shredder. Because he applies his own Pyro, he can interfere and make Ineffa miss a few vapes with her normal attacks. But generally, I just like how he plays with the team. If you want a unit that does a lot less interference, you can run Shilonen. She has stronger res shred than him, and she'll also shred res for Hydro, affecting Farina's damage. I should actually also mention, because on-fielding Ineffa changes what gear she's able to use, throwing Ino in the slot, or of course in the future, Columbina, gives us a second Nod Cry unit, gives us Ascendant Moongleam. That lets Ineffa run Night of the Skies Unveiling. But of course, in that same measure, since we're running Farina, we can throw her on Mara Chaussee, and she'll do just fine. You know what? Overall, the Durin variation might be a better team, but I feel like Durin, this happened just fine when I was originally testing, but I can't seem to get it in recording. Durin is making me miss a few too many of my vapes, which is kind of just like missing the point of this section. So let's try with Shilonen and at least see what big numbers we can get. Here we go. Got some nice 30Ks up there. I can tell you that I think the Shilonen variation of this is worse, but it's the one that focuses far more on Ineffa's damage. Between Shilonen providing more res shred and not messing with the auras and making Ineffa lose vapes, you do get to see more out of Ineffa herself and out of an Ineffa carried team. I'm assuming that's what most people would want. I believe the Durin variation is better because of how much personal damage he does, but it definitely takes Ineffa out of the spotlight. Ooh. I saw a 38k too. I'm seeing like vape charge attacks that are larger than her lunar charge numbers. And for reference, this is only talent level 6 normals. She can definitely go higher with these. But I think that's gonna be it. This is a good team to finish off on, and this video is probably long enough already. So not only is Ineffa just kind of a busted unit all around, she is crazy versatile, and even when you aren't taking full advantage of all of the things that she does, she provides enough strange utility things to enable all sorts of weird team comps, or even just be a decent comfort option for characters that she wasn't necessarily built for. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to LD Shop for sponsoring this video, and thank you to my channel members for making these videos possible. DorsalFin1 from twitch.tv/DorsalFin1, Najodo, Rumpaltos, PegB, Dades, Zach, Mudkip1727, Beef Potato, Roberto Desu, Big Soup, Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, Amat, Tede, Aqua, Maho Shojoruru, Smoothie, and Star Nova. Thank you so much for your consistent support across the months, and thank you for making longer videos like this that take more of my time possible. I hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.